Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, and is always available for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. This evening, on a special edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the soon-to-be-released book, Jerry Lee Lewis, His Own Story, Rick Bragg. Rick will be joining me at our table after a brief message from our sponsors. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, on Blog Talk Radio, and be sure to visit us at our newest home on iHeartRadio. Today, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. With over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre, you'll find what you're looking for. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. Join me November 16th through 23rd at the nation's largest book fair, the 31st Miami Book Fair International in warm and sunny Miami at Miami-Dade College. Mingle with 400-plus authors from around the world, including Patricia Cornwell, Dave Barry, John Dean, Philip Margolin, Anne Rice, Elizabeth Nunez, and Joanna Rakoff. Listen to the authors read their own words, answer your questions, and autograph your books. For more information, visit MiamiBookFair.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. See you there. Hello, I'm Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Join me Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern when I talk with the great artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and celebrities of our day. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is talk radio for fine minds. Tune in live or listen to the podcast at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Rick Bragg is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of the New York Times bestsellers All Over But the Shoutin', Ava's Man, The Prince of Frogtown, and I Am a Soldier Too, The Jessica Lynch Story. He has twice won the prestigious American Society of Newspaper Editors Distinguished Writing Award and more than 50 writing awards in his career. He is currently a professor of writing at the University of Alabama. Jerry Lee Lewis helped define the wild frontier of rock and roll. His most recent albums, Last Man Standing and Mean Old Man, were his most successful in 30 years. Still performing today, he recently opened Jerry Lee Lewis's Cafe and Honky Tonk on Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee. Together, Bragg and Lewis have created an amazing biography of the music legend, Jerry Lee Lewis, His Own Story, the result of 2 summers when Bragg interviewed Lewis for this groundbreaking new book. So, Rick, I gotta tell you, this is wow. Hear me? I'm telling you this on air. This is wow, wow, wow. This is absolutely a gorgeously written book. What heart, what soul. And you know, it's crossed my little brain. It's a boogie woogie send up to arguably one of the great performers of all time. You can use that, buddy, to sell this book, because honestly, that's exactly what it is. Jerry Lee Lewis did himself a favor when he chose you for the project. But here's the question. Let's get to the question. You're both Southerners, of course. And isn't Lewis's story in some ways just the quintessential Southern story?
I think it is. It's very much Southern Gothic. It sounds made up because he really did make Elvis cry. You know, he really did grow up in the Louisiana bottomland. His daddy really did crawl into the attic to kill a knot of writhing rattlesnakes that were poking through the knot holes in the wood over Jerry Lee's bed. This is Southern reality of the Depression era. And before he ever made it to Memphis, you know, down the road that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil on, before he ever even started that trip, his story was pure Southern Gothic. And, how could you not want to tell that?
Absolutely. You were born, what, in 1959 in Possum Trot, or you lived in Possum Trot?
Yeah. We actually were in a suburb of Possum Trot, so we were not in the town center of Possum Trot. People laugh at that, but I was born in a little place called Piedmont Hospital in the foothills of the Appalachians.
And a year after Lewis's fall from grace.
Right, exactly. Yeah, almost exactly a year.
Yeah.
And,
so I imagine you're being a Southerner. You were familiar with him, so he didn't come to you out of the whatever. But what I want to know is how you guys got together. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I had grown up, as a lot of people did, from that. I'd grown up with Jerry Lee's music. His big rock and roll hits were still circulating on the radio. I heard them, in my bedroom on a radio tune to one of those big Yankee radio stations, New York or Chicago or St. Louis. I can't remember which one, but, they were playing oldies rock and roll. And by the time I was old enough to pay attention, it was oldies. It was a whole lot of shaking going on and Great Balls of Fire, the same songs that everyone knows. But his country music and, that rolling boogie-woogie country had also drifted down, this time from Nashville and Memphis on the radio. And so I was a fan, but what happened, I'd love to pretend that this had a real picturesque beginning, that, Jerry Lee and I had bumped into each other during a bar fight, in Mississippi or something like that, but that ain't the way it happened. No. My agent called me out of the blue one day from New York and said, "You got any interest in doing a book on Jerry Lee Lewis?" And I really should have gone and hid. I should have crawled under the bed. But I thought, how could this be dull? How could it not be fun? First of all, just to listen to him talk. But then also, if you're a Southern writer and you have the kind of mother lode of Southern Gothic, you got to do it. Just have to.
Absolutely, and I get that. Now listen to me. I'm one of those people who believe it all begins at zero, and much of the roadmaps of our lives are paved by the time we're 5. So let's do a little background on Mr. Jerry Lee Lewis. He was born in 1935 to parents Elmo and Mamie Lewis. You take it from there. Give us a little background.
Well, Jerry Lee was born into this great entwined. His family, I like to describe as one of those balls of rubber bands that you see on desk. Every one runs into the other one and wraps around the other one. And, he has, double first cousins. The family intermarried, cousins married cousins. And it was the Lewises, of course, the Gillies, the Swaggarts, of course, Jimmy Swaggart, is his double first cousin. And they grew up in a house without insulation, in a house without plumbing, in a house without electricity, in places named Turtle Lake and Black Lake, the town. And his daddy was a carpenter, and he made liquor and went to prison twice for making liquor. And when Jerry Lee was a toddler, his daddy had to come home to bury his son, Jerry Lee's older brother, who was run over by a drunk driver. And he came home from federal prison in shackles, in chains, and held his son over the lip of the grave. You did not have to stretch, or you did not have to try to be picturesque in telling the story of Jerry Lee's life. They fought hard against it in the poverty, in that dirt there. And, music was the one thing, and faith, I guess, that lifted them out. That, his childhood was, as he called it, was hard, but it was also very rich.
I imagine his talent was clear early on, right? And the parents didn't have a lot of money, obviously, but his mother or father, I guess, together, they bought him that first piano, yes?
Yeah, the greatest. I think that it's been described as the greatest investment in the history of American music. He learned to play early. The story goes, and he tells it and swears it is true, that he was walking through his Uncle Lee's house, his Aunt Stella and Uncle Lee's house, and he saw a piano. They were wealthier, and they had a piano in their house when he was, wasn't even in school yet. And he sees this piano and he sits down on it and he touched the keys and played a song. And his hands just knew where to go. And his daddy and his mama clapped her hands together and said that, it has to, such a thing can only come from God. And Elmo, his daddy, not long after that, came driving up in his pickup with an old Start piano that he'd bought used on the back, and looked at his son and said, "There it is, boy, play it." And from then on, at least until he discovered girls, that was really all Jerry Lee Lewis did. That and get in trouble.
Yeah, well, hey, goes with the territory.
It is Jerry Lee.
Right, exactly. First of all, one of the things that I think that you mentioned in the book, and I think this is so powerful, and he said it, that his parents believed in him.
Right.
Not every performer can go back and say, my parents believed in me.
That's true. And as I wrote it, I didn't really think about the import. I thought it was a beautiful thing to say.
Right.
But, it goes back to that scene on the river when, Jerry Lee was a boy and the people on the party boats that would go down the river, would dance and drink to these bands that were on these big party boats. Think river boats. And they used to make fun of Jerry Lee and his mom and dad. They would toast them with their glasses, real crystal, on these boats, and they would toast them and kind of mockingly. And you can just imagine what that would do to a working man and woman.
Sure, absolutely.
Or their child. And Jerry Lee's daddy, who had heard his son play, pulled Jerry Lee to his hip and said, "That'll be you, that'll be you up there." And yeah, they believed in him. And it is to this day, it's the first thing he thinks about when he thinks about his mother and father.
It's something to hold on to. As I said, not everybody is that fortunate. His mother, however, who was devoutly Christian, enrolled him in Southwest Bible Institute. But he was hearing Boogie Woogie Beat early on.
He is probably the first and only member of the Waxahachie Bible school to be kicked out for rampant boogie woogie. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great one. Let's jump ahead a little bit just for the sake of time. But the first big hit, the Sun record years. Tell us about those years, because wow, he just came on and there he was. Wow.
It was great fun. I mean, listening to him talk about he and his father, literally, trying to decide in the middle of the cornfield, how do we pay for this trip to Memphis? And so they gathered eggs, sold eggs to pay for the first trip, down, actually it would be up Highway 61, to Memphis. And Jerry Lee talked his way into the studio, said he was the greatest piano player who ever lived, talked his way into the studio and performed a song called Crazy Arms for the engineer there. And when Sam Phillips, the man who snagged lightning more than once in the early days of rock and roll, when he heard it, he thought, I can sell that. And that, of course, led to long months of searching for the hit, that one song. And Jerry Lee heard it one night in a honky-tonk, heard a song called, A Whole Lot of Shakin' Goin On, and knew that was a song that he could conquer the world with. And he did. Took it, eventually recorded it at Sun. Not a lot of people had a lot of faith in that song early on. But he tore it up, went to New York, performed it, talked his way with the help of, actually it was Sam Phillips' brother, Judd Phillips, who was selling used cars down in Florence, Alabama. Judd talked their way onto the Steve Allen show. Jerry Lee played it in front of a national audience. All hell broke loose, and
the rest, as they say, is history.
Right. He's on his way.
Right. Absolutely. The Killer moniker, where'd that come from?
It'd be great if it'd be great if there was a dark, angle to this, but there's not. He was at school in Faraday. He had been held back a grade, and this is when he was in grammar school, and he'd been held back a grade, and he didn't want to be held back a grade. So he decided to fight the teacher for the privilege of staying in that grade. And he and the teacher tied up in a fist fight in the middle of homeroom. And Jerry Lee managed to get hold of the guy's necktie. And he was swinging on it like a clapper on a bell, just swinging. and the guy was choking to death. And finally, some other students pulled Jerry Lee off him and carried Jerry Lee bodily to the principal's office, where another little boy named Cecil Harrelson, was sitting in there, and he too had been in a fight with a teacher, and they were both suspended. And as they walked out the gate, Harrelson turned to Jerry Lee and said, "Well, see you later, killer." And that name stuck. It had nothing to do with Jerry Lee's stage presence or his performances or his propensity for violence. You know, he hit 5 or 6 men with the butt end of his microphone during shows. So it had nothing to do with, you know, accidentally shooting his bass player in the chest. Had nothing to do with any of that. It was 2 little boys, you know, walking home in disgrace from homeroom.
Interesting how it all plays into the whole picture of him and the whole PR, you know.
Oh, is it perfect?
Thing.
It was the perfect
right?
thing.
I mean, how lucky was he? Let's talk about the performance acumen. He was an original. The shenanigans on stage, however, including the kicking over the piano bench, that came out of an accident.
Right. He you know, and for Jerry Lee to claim anything as an accident is, of course, you have to immediately think, wait a minute.
Go back to the PR.
Right. But in this case, it was true. He was serious and continued to be serious about the music for a lifetime. But things would get in the way. You know, the drinking would get in the way. The pills would get in the way. His personal life would get in the way. Everything would get in the way. But in this case, early on, when he was first performing for Sun and those package tours where you just go rumbling across Canada, you know, in 3 Cadillacs, you know, that kind of stuff, playing these little shows, he hated to be trapped on the bench. He hated the fact that the piano player had to sit still, and so he would come up off the piano and play standing up. Well, the bench is in the way. So one day he tried to just nudge it back with his foot, but a buckle or a strap on his boot caught the bench and it went flying backwards. And the crowd went wild, for lack of a better cliche. And Jerry Lee thought, oh, so this is what they want. And so he kicked it every time that he was able. Very few piano benches actually made he only destroyed a few pianos probably over time. He beat some half to death, but he probably sent a whole lot of piano benches to the scrap pile.
Love it. He played with Elvis. As you said, he made him cry. He made Chuck Berry seethe. What did he tell you about all of that?
Well, Chuck Berry was, you know, if you can imagine 2 game roosters on a yard, you know, that's what he and Chuck Berry were. They were, you know, Chuck, seethe is the perfect word. Chuck was on fire from injustices that he had endured, from going to prison, from, you know, just being turned away from venue after venue because the club owners didn't know that he was a black man. Because, you know, Chuck played a sound that was different from blues. You know, it had a country, you know, whang in it. And you know, when, you know, and he was a man. And when he and Jerry Lee, who was a strutting rooster himself, you know, came together on stage, who closes the show? Well, you know, there was some disagreement over that. And Jerry Lee really did, after agreeing, because Chuck had the bigger billing at the time, after agreeing that Chuck would close the show, Jerry Lee, you know, went through encore after encore, then stood up, took a small bottle of gasoline, a little Coke bottle full of gasoline, from hiding, and poured it on the piano and set it on fire, and walked off to, you know, huge applause and certainly a few gasps, and, you know, and walked by Chuck and said, you know, follow that. And there are varying stories as to what else he said, but another time he actually, during a show, he picked up a guitar and began to play Johnny Be Good while Chuck waited in the wings. So they picked at each other. Jerry Lee's daddy put a knife to Chuck's throat in a New York show, So they fought, and they not physically, they never came to blows, but it's a wonder.
It's a wonder.
Elvis is a much more complicated story.
You want to tell it, or you want to hold it?
I can tell a little.
Yeah, tell a little.
I can tell a little bit. You know, my favorite story in the whole book is not profound, but it was the day that Elvis and Jerry Lee met, and you have to understand a little something about a Southern boy and what he cares about. You know, we love our mamas, and you know, we love women, but mostly we kind of love our cars. And you know, the day it happened, Elvis comes sauntering into Sun Records with a Las Vegas showgirl on his arm. Jerry Lee remembers that he was wearing a chocolate brown sport jacket. And Elvis, the most famous man in the world in that moment, swaggers into Sun Records and says, "I want to meet that piano player," or "I've been meaning to meet that piano player." And Jerry Lee Lewis, throws his head back and says, "Well, here I am." And Elvis had seen a beautiful red Cadillac out front. And he says to Jerry Lee, "Is that your car out front?" And Jerry Lee says, "It is," like he was born in a Cadillac. And Elvis says, "Man, that's a beautiful car." And Jerry Lee says, "I try to keep a good car." Like, again, it wasn't the first good car he'd ever been in his life. And there was something very honest about that, about this first exchange between the two. Man, that's a beautiful car. Mm-hmm. And they became true friends. Jerry Lee all the time intending to take what Elvis had. Jerry Lee didn't want to be a rock and roll star. He wanted to be the rock and roll star. He wanted what Elvis had. He wanted the crown. And he did a good job trying to get it. And then Elvis, of course, was drafted and left to go into the Army, and knew deep in his heart that it was all over. And he didn't let Jerry Lee take it. He gave it to him. He actually said in the middle of a crowded studio at Sun Records on another afternoon with, people looking on, in tears, told Jerry Lee, take it. And, which is not the way that Jerry Lee wanted that to happen.
He wanted to earn it.
Yeah, he wanted to wrest it from him.
Right.
And the scene was not picturesque. Again, you got all these people looking on, and but they stayed friends. And Jerry Lee would go to Graceland, or they would meet in Las Vegas, and Jerry Lee would play the piano, and Elvis would lean on the piano lid and just listen to the melodies, just listen to the gospel music and the old love songs that Jerry Lee would play. And sometimes we would have Jerry Lee play the same song over and over and over and over again. And their friendship endured. And, until that, you hate to say until that fateful night, but until one night, not long before Elvis's death, when he called Jerry Lee, told him to come by Graceland to talk. Jerry Lee decided to prepare for that he would go to a bar, get champagne drunk. While he was getting champagne drunk, someone gave him a loaded Derringer, which is what just happens with Southern boys. If you're going to have a room full of drunk Southern boys, why not hand one of them a pistol? And Jerry Lee left the bar drunk with a half bottle of champagne swinging from one arm and the loaded Derringer in the other. And he got in his in his Lincoln Continental, which he was only driving because he had flipped his Rolls Royce a few days before, and drove to Graceland, didn't time his trip up the driveway very well, and crashed into the gates of Graceland with an empty bottle of champagne and a loaded Derringer on the dash. And Jerry Lee, thinking, maybe I better get rid of this champagne bottle, tried to throw it out the window, but had not rolled the window down. So glass showered him. The Derringer slips to the floorboard. Jerry Lee gets out and says he's there to see Elvis. And, of course, the security guard called the police, and at Elvis's request. And Jerry Lee never got in to see his friend that last time. He did go to jail, and for years, I think even today, tour guides tell about the day that Jerry Lee Lewis crashed the gates of Graceland with a loaded gun, intending to do Elvis harm. And Jerry Lee is disgusted by that, because while he might not have had his stuff together the day that he crashed the gates, he didn't intend to hurt his friend. And nothing makes him madder than the notion that he went to kill Elvis. You can't make his stuff up.
No, I'm sure not. Let's take this out a little bit further, because this guy gets to the top, so respected, and self-destruction is inherent in every bone in his body.
Yeah.
From stupid stuff that one goes, to, he marries his first cousin, once removed, 13-year-old Myra Gale Brown, and by the way, not his first marriage. And one of 7 to come. And he takes a huge hit for that. I mean, nobody would touch him after that. That was the end of it, really, including Dick Clark.
Right.
Did you ask him, what was the penchant there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, you can never assume that Jerry Lee Lewis cares what anybody thinks. He married Myra because he wanted to. And he said over and over again to me, I'd done what I wanted. And other people just wish they could have done what I'd done. And that might not be the best thing to hear, but at least he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. And, as he was crucified, it all started with the London trip, the trip to England, where Myra was kind of outed. While he was being crucified for that, and unapologetic for that, Elvis was, had his own situation. Priscilla came to Graceland and lived on the grounds, or lived with, his mom and dad, utterly chaperoned. At least that was the way that the press handled it. And, Elvis is lauded as, what a good boy. They even sent Priscilla to, I think, to Catholic school, while she lived there. And to Jerry Lee, that was, of course, just the worst kind of hypocrisy. To Jerry Lee, it was, that Elvis hid Priscilla, and he refused to hide Myra. So Jerry Lee saw himself as standing on some pretty firm high ground, if you can imagine that in such a situation. And he always was resentful. He always thought that Elvis got a pass. That Elvis was such a good, pure boy for the way he waited for Priscilla to come of age. And that just still, I think, that burned in Jerry Lee's stomach for a very long time. But that said, he did what he wanted. And when he fell from grace, he loaded up 3 Cadillacs full of musicians and drum sets and guitars and went on the road and fought and clawed his way back to some celebrity, to some stardom, but never at the level that he had before, until much later he went country.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk this a little bit. You mentioned country, and I think that's a good place. We got that. We all know that. But I want to go ahead to you. I want to talk about you a little bit. You and the Killer, 2 summers, intimate conversation. Was he a hard nut to crack, or was he willing to tell all? And let me ask you this, even needing Rick to tell all, maybe you were there to help him figure it all out? What?
Well, I wish it were that. I mean, I wish it were. I wish that I had given him that vehicle, and maybe I did. But that's kind of claiming a lot. What happened was day after day after day. He was suffering the ailments of Job. He had everything from bouts of pneumonia to compound fracture in one leg to crippling arthritis in his back that prevented him from even sitting up. He is much better now, but he had everything from shingles to you name it. He suffered, and he was kicking still a lifelong addiction to pills and to painkillers. So day after day after day, I sat in this rocking chair beside his bedside, and he kind of talked me through his life. And yeah, there were places where I had to prod. There were places where I had to push. And then there were days where all I had to do was say, and what happened then? And it seemed like that was the mantra. And what happened then? And what happened then? And some days, like talking about the death of his 2 sons, especially, his older boy who died as a man after his personality had formed and Jerry Lee had come to know him. Listening to him talk about the funeral and Ray, they had covered the boy's face with a little piece of silk, and Jerry Lee had raised it to kiss his son goodbye. And the words that he said, it was so painful that sometimes he would physically turn away. And, they were hard days. And, it didn't bother Jerry Lee to talk about the violence he lived. It didn't bother him to talk about hitting a man in the face with the butt of a microphone stand, because he did it over and over again. It didn't bother him to talk about his sins. It didn't bother him that much to talk about, private planes where the law enforcement agents would come on board and shake pills out of the seat cushions. None of that bothered him as much as loss. The death of his mama, still fresh after all this time. And some days I did have to push, and some days I did have to prod. But most days I just had to sit there and rock. And it remains, sometimes I forget how lucky it was for me to get to do that.
You convey that he remains a haunted man, still plagued by the question, can a man play rock and roll and still go to heaven? This religious thing, inherent, something he was fighting all of his life.
And it fights now.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I think that's so much who the whole battle was about in a way.
Oh, yeah. People who have interviewed him in the past like to refer to Jerry Lee as being caught in the tentacles of this unfathomable religion. Well, those of us who grew up, down here, my people were Congregational Holiness, Pentecostals, very similar to Assembly of God, which is what Jerry Lee and Elvis were. And this religion, I heard an old mill worker tell me once that they preached it hard, son. They preached it so hard you couldn't live it. And it was unforgiving at best. And they played great music, but the faith itself, the preaching of it, was literal. And there are two directions. You can walk in glory, or you can burn in a lake of fire. And Jerry Lee learned that before he was even able to understand it. And see, this is the thing. To know something doesn't mean you adhere to it. Sin is, especially if you're Jerry Lee Lewis and you're good at it. There were so many enticements, and he gave in, and he gave in across a lifetime. And he would rediscover that fear constantly. He lived with that fear that he was paying a terrible price for this. It doesn't mean you stop, just means you fear. And some days it's a nagging thing that rides with you through your hangovers and your DTs and your fist fights, and some days it keeps you awake all night thinking about burning. And what haunted Jerry Lee more than anything else was this notion, this tenet. And he was talking about this, he said, one of the things about going to hell is that it will be as if you were never known. What that means is that the people who love you, your family, all the people who love you will not know you, will not remember you. And can you imagine a greater hell than that for Jerry Lee Lewis?
Unbelievable.
He longed to have that question answered. Because, like for instance, Jimmy Swaggart kept telling him over and over and over again, you play this secular music, this music about sex, and you're gonna go to hell. So he wanted to know, can a man play rock and roll music and go to heaven? And the one person he could ask was, of course, Elvis, who was also haunted by it. And he asked Elvis that, and Elvis turned white as bone and walked from the room. So he never got that answer. He thinks sometimes that maybe that's what he and Elvis would have talked about there at Graceland the night he got drunk and ran the gate. But he thinks about it now. But now he believes that his mama was right, that this gift that he had, this gift to play this music, lifts the blues off people, and that such a gift is not product of Satan, that such a gift has to come from a better place than that. So he clings to that hope, and he prepares himself to leave this world. Jerry Lee doesn't care what you or I think. He greatly cares about that question. Where will he spend eternity? And so he prays. He prays over his food. He prays before he goes to sleep at night. He tithes, and he tries to live. The life that the old preachers preached. And, and he says over and over again, I guess we'll see, won't we, boy?
I know that you say that you found him to be a man with a big heart. Is that discovery what most surprised you about him, or was there some other nugget that you found that surprised you most?
That's a good question. I don't know, and when you say that you find Jerry Lee to be a man with a big heart, that ain't every day.
Well, I'm sure. None of us are every day.
Yeah. Some days he takes more pride in devilment than any man I've ever known. If you want him to laugh, tell him a story of your own foibles. Tell him a story of crashing your own car, flipping your own car at 100 miles an hour, or tell him a story of getting punched in the face. He'll greatly enjoy that story. But the thing that surprised me was how soft and gentle he could be at times. And I admit, he won me over on a trip home. My mother had a heart attack, and she had to have a stent, and I was with her. I was with my brother Sam, and we were outside the operating room. I was scared to death, and just scared to death. And it seemed like it took forever. And the phone rings, and it's the killer on the line. And he just wanted to check on my mom and wanted to see how I was doing. He didn't have to do that. We were not lifelong friends, We were not kin. He just wanted to check. And there's a lot more to him than most people, I think, know. And hopefully this book will show that. But it does not try to whitewash him.
No, for sure.
That is a thing that requires more effort. There ain't enough whitewash in the world.
I want to go 2 more places with you very quickly. Sure. He was among the first class of inductees in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm wondering if he saw that as a recompense, if you will, for the grief that he got from so many in the biz.
I think he did, and I think he was greatly honored to be among that class. And I think you saw it not in the ceremony, because people wondered if he would even live to be at the ceremony. His obit's been written 3 times, well, actually more than that, certainly, but it's been touched up at least 3 times. But yeah, he was honored to be there among Chuck Berry, among Elvis and Sam Phillips and those people, and Buddy Holly, who he adored. But after it was all over with, he and Chuck Berry and the other musicians, the other great musicians there, just tore it up on stage. And I think to play in that exaltation, to beat that piano in that company across the years, I think it was a vindication of sorts for him.
I want to close this interview in a sense where we began. Jerry Lee Lewis, His Own Story, by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Rick Bragg, is sheer poetry, truly. Going forward, Rick, after spending all that time with the legendary and complex man that is music legend Jerry Lee Lewis, you've had your own trials and tribulations, haven't we all? How has the map of your life been altered by your time with him?
That's a very good question. I think the thing that you realize is that if Jerry Lee Lewis can still walk out onto a stage and sit down and beat out a honky-tonk song that makes you glad to be alive, if Jerry Lee Lewis, who is supposed to have been dead already so many times, who has risen and fallen and risen and fallen and fallen and risen so many times, if Jerry Lee Lewis can still be here pounding those keys and doing the one thing that he loves to do, then surely we can all live forever. Surely we got a chance.
I've been speaking with Rick Bragg, author of Jerry Lee Lewis, His Own Story, by way of HarperCollins. Meet Rick Bragg at the 31st Annual Miami Book Fair International, Sunday, November 23rd at 12 p.m. in downtown Miami at Miami-Dade College. And look for Jerry Lee Lewis's new albums, Rock and Roll Time and the Knox Phillips Sessions, the unreleased recordings of Jerry Lee Lewis. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that podcasts of current and past shows are always available to listen to free on iTunes under the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is also available for download via Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, BlogTalkRadio.com, and a host of other venues. Google the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, and you will find us. Of course, podcasts of our shows, both past and present, are always posted for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, which I hope you'll visit often for the latest information on our upcoming segments. Oh, and while you're at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, don't forget to visit my blog to read my latest musings. I'll be back next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, Talk Radio for Fine Minds, brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Audible.com features over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Stay in touch, won't you? Remember, that's HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Discover us on Facebook at Halli Casser-Jayne and on Twitter at HalliCJ. I love to hear from you. So, till we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.